Good evening and welcome everyone to Tech Talks, the virtual series designed to provide technical assistance to residents interested in learning more about Glynn County Superfund sites. I'm your host, Rachel Thompson. A few housekeeping items before we begin. All microphones will stay muted until we reach the question and answer session at the end of the presentation. If you have a question in the meantime, please enter it into the chat and we will go through each one during the Q&A session. Oops. Tech Talks are brought to you by the Glynn Environmental Coalition, a nonprofit organization founded in the 1990s by concerned citizens wanting to know how our community became so polluted, why we continue to have health-threatening levels of pollution, and how an action plan could be developed to correct the problem. The fact that you're joining us here today means that you share the concern of our founding members, and we thank you so much for joining us this evening. So we wanted to start off our Tech Talks, our virtual series, by going over just some of the basics, whether you are familiar with the Superfund process or this is the first time you're getting an introduction to Superfund sites. So we first wanted to start off with a general definition of what is a Superfund site. A Superfund site is any designated hazardous waste site. In Georgia, we have over 500 designated sites. However, out of those 500, we have federally designated sites. And that brings me to our next question, our first question that we would like to answer. And that is, where did the law that governs Superfund came from? So I'm going to switch my screens momentarily to play a short video that was developed in partnership with the College of Coastal Georgia by a student.
The birth of the Superfund program. A long time ago, a mom named Lois Gibbs raised her voice so loud it would ring for decades to come. A ditch on a piece of land was owned by Hooker Chemical Company in 1953. That very ditch was used as a dump for their toxic waste. This land was then sold for $1 single US dollar, and a school was built over top. But soon enough, this ticking time bomb below the ground exploded. Record amounts of rainfall caused for these carcinogenous chemicals to end up all over the community. Gardens were dying, trees were withering. Puddles of substances formed on the school grounds. A choking smell took over the air. Young children would come home with burns coating their hands and faces. Lois Gibbs would not tolerate this any longer. Her and the mothers of the community rose together and demanded the government be held accountable for protecting their citizens. Members of the community held 2 government employees as hostage in the contaminated sites in desperate attempts to save the future of their health. Finally, the CERCLA was born. The Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. The CERCLA gave the government the ability to provide people and money towards cleanup of contaminated sites. They also had the power to hold parties responsible for the contamination to either do the cleanups or reimburse the government for doing so for them.
So now we are going to spend a little time talking specifically about Glynn County's Superfund sites. And remember, a Superfund site is any designated hazardous waste site. but we do have different entities who are in charge of those. So in Glynn County, we have 4 federally designated Superfund sites. We also have about a dozen state designated Superfund sites. And the main difference between those two is who is in charge of the cleanup, or who's managing the cleanup from the state or federal agencies. So our 4 federally designated sites in Glynn County are the Hercules 009 landfill, Brunswick wood preserving, the Terry Creek Superfund site, and LCP chemicals. And these are the 4 nationally designated Superfund sites, which means that the EPA, or the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, primarily is the entity that is moving the cleanup forward. In most of these cases, there is a responsible party, which we'll talk about that in just a little bit as well. But the EPA is very heavily involved. The state level designated hazardous waste sites, which in our series this year, we might spend a little bit of time talking about those. Those are going to be primarily managed by the Environmental Protection Division, or the EPD, and their land protection branch, and they have a hazardous waste program. I apologize, my slides are not moving forward as quickly as they should be. There we go. So these are the 4 nationally designated hazardous waste sites here in Glynn County. Again, Brunswick wood preserving, Hercules 009 landfill, LCP chemicals, and Terry Creek Superfund site. We're gonna zoom in a little bit, and today, just because of time, we want to keep these tech talks brief. I'm going to give a general overview of the site, where it's located, and then in future episodes, we'll kind of get deeper into each of the individual sites. We're going to start off with Hercules 009 landfill. And again, I'd like to start off by geographically orienting everyone. So hopefully you can see my mouse on the screen. This is the Golden Isles Parkway, also known as the Spur. And this is the Nally dealership right here. This is Altama on the right-hand side of the picture. And you can see this little pie slice. Here is the Hercules 009 landfill. One of the most important parts of becoming an aware citizen and understanding where these Superfund sites are is understanding what's around them. So that's why we always start with the geographic orientation. So where are we? And you can see in this area, we do have some neighborhoods. And this piece of property right off the south end of Nick's Lane, there was some development that went in here in the past few years. And then just north of that development, we've got the former Altama Elementary School, and currently that is the Glynn County Board of Education building. So a little bit about this site. Initially, the site was home to a borrow pit, or an area that is created to remove sediments for use in another location. The excavated material, so the soil that was removed from that site, was used for the lining of the roadbed of the spur. And the borrow pit was later abandoned and naturally filled with water to become a pond. From 1948 to the early 1980s, Hercules, the manufacturing facility across town, which we'll talk a little bit about that plant in just a little, they manufacture toxaphene at the facility located near Highway 17 and the St. Simons Island Causeway. From 1976 to 1980, Hercules operated a permitted industrial landfill north of the former Barrow pit. Wastewater sludge and other manufacturing wastes were dumped into 6 lined cells until the Georgia Environmental Protection Division canceled Hercules landfill permit and required closure of the landfill. Poor disposal practices at the site resulted in soil, surface water, and groundwater contamination. The US EPA designated it a Superfund site in 1983, meaning it was one of the first Superfund sites that was designated in Glynn County, and compelled Hercules to investigate the site starting in 1988. Toxaphene, benzene, and other contamination was found at levels which required cleanup of the soil, surface waters, and groundwater at the site. And again, we are going to be moving on to our next site. If you have any questions, put them in the chat. But again, we'll do a deeper dive in future episodes of our Tech Talks. The next site that we're going to take a look at is the Brunswick Wood Preserving Site, which is located on the more northern portion of the county, on the other side, or the west side of Interstate 95. The Brunswick Wood Preserving Site housed wood treatment and preserving operations from 1958 to 1991. Regular use of chemicals such as creosote, pentachlorophenol, and copper chromium arsenate contaminated the site's groundwater and soil, which required long-term cleanup. Other chemicals of concern includes dense non-aqueous phase liquids and sediment chemicals such as naphthalene, benzene, and other semi-volatile organic compounds. And again, just to geographically orient ourselves, right here we have Perry Lane Road. Over this side of the site, which is to the west, would be to the west, is Highway 341, or the northern parts of Old Jessup Road. And then in this direction, you've got Kate Road and the Spur, the Winn-Dixie, in that direction. So relatively unpopulated area, especially in comparison to the other Superfund sites that we're looking at today. You can see densely forested here. There is a neighborhood just south of the site, and there are some light industrial operations nearby, including Glynn Iron, which is just on the other side of the railroad. But this is and was and is a ideal industrial location because of the proximity of the rail lines. You can see there. All right, and moving on, again, if you have additional questions, please let us know in the chat. Or if you're on Facebook, you can drop them in the Facebook comment section. Okay, next we are going to look at Terry Creek Superfund site, located on the bottom corner of the screen. And I forgot to start with the geographic orientation on the last one, but I'm not going to miss it this time. So right in front of us, along the bottom of the picture, we have Highway 17. And in the corner coming across, this is the St. Simons Island Causeway. This site is about 200 acres, just over 200 acres. And a significant majority of that is marsh and estuary. You can see here. The official name of the site is Terry Creek Outfall Ditch and Dredge Spoils Superfund site. But most people just call it Terry Creek or Hercules. But I would like to point out that Highway 17 actually separates the site into two parts. And this is something that can be very frustrating for individuals, residents like yourselves that are trying to understand what is going on with these hazardous waste sites in our community. But on one side of the road, on the east side of Highway 17, so again, that's what's pictured, sorry, here. That is managed by CERCLA, which is the law that I mentioned at the beginning. And that's the Superfund program. The other side of the site, the west portion of the site, which housed the previously active Pinova facility, because it was an active facility up until June of this year, or 2023, that portion of the site was actually managed under RCRA, which is the Resource Conservation Reclamation Act. And that is really designed for active facilities. And the cleanup there is primarily led by the Georgia Environmental Protection Division. So again, that can be frustrating for citizens that are looking to engage in the process, because you have a different regulatory agency on one side of the street compared to the other, which means that one staff person from the federal government, from the EPA, might not be able to answer your questions about what's going on across the street. We are working to address that issue and try to get a panel of individuals available, but it is very difficult to get the EPA and the EPD and all the project managers in one place at one time. But it has happened in the past. The last time that happened was in October of actually 2022. So it can happen. And we're going to be looking at trying to do that this year. Enough about that. I want to tell you about how this site got here. And again, I kind of mentioned this when we were talking about Hercules 009. From 1948 to 1980, the Hercules Brunswick plant produced pesticides. They created toxaphene, and their industrial wastewater flowed into Dupree Creek through the outfall ditch, which is this blue area. This section here is Dupree Creek. And this section here is Terry Creek. And it leads to Back River, which eventually leads to the St. Simon Sound. The industrial wastewater contained toxaphene and most notably the manufacturing waste of the creation of toxaphene. So toxaphene, what was sold on the market, but obviously they weren't throwing their product in their wastewater. So that was the manufacturing waste of the toxaphene itself. And some of those pesticides are still present in the outfall ditch sediments, Terry and Dupree Creek sediments, and the dredge spoil disposal areas. And so the name, of course, is dredge spoils. And that name comes from when the Army Corps of Engineers dredged Dupree and Terry Creeks. It was a commercial navigable channel. And in order for them to maintain that as a viable way to bring in barges of material, they had to dredge that channel. And so when they were dredging, they were taking those contaminated sediments and placing them elsewhere. And so that is where the name dredge spoils comes from, and the name. And last but not least, we have the LCP Chemicals Superfund site, which is located just north of the Georgia Pacific or Brunswick Cellulose plant. We'll zoom in a little bit here. So it's a very large site. This site is over 800 acres, and about 700 acres are marsh and estuary and surface water. So again, to geographically orient everyone, this road right here, which serves as the northern boundary of the site, is Highway 303, or also known as the Blythe Island Causeway. The western boundary of the site is the Turtle River itself. The southern boundary of the site actually shares a property line with Georgia Pacific or Brunswick Cellulose Plant. And then 341 kind of comes around this way, but in other, the marsh also kind of borders the area between the marsh and the forest here. So you can see it's zoomed in a little bit on this side. The Georgia Pacific down here, Highway 303 up here, and 341 over here. So this site had various manufacturing or various different industries from the 1920s through 1994. It first was Arco Oil Refinery, which is where the name of the Arco community comes from. It was the community that was built just outside of the fence line of the oil refinery, which our planning and zoning laws have smartened up since, plants since the 1920s. We know now that it's not great to put people and homes and residential properties in close distances with industrial manufacturing. However, when plants like this and Hercules were established, most people didn't really have vehicles, so they wanted people to be able to walk or bike to work. So residential areas were put right nearby. There also was a paint and varnish manufacturing plant. And then the majority of the industrial legacy of this site was the chloralkali or chlorine gas manufacturing that started in the late 40s and continued through the mid 90s. And the EPA actually went in 1994 and shut this facility down, which was a big deal for our community at the time. And still is a big deal. Obviously, it's a very large economic piece of property that has been economically blighted and environmentally blighted for many, many years. Contaminants at the site primarily include polychlorinated biphenyls or PCBs, mercury, lead, dioxins, and hydrocarbons, and they are still present and impacting the soils, groundwater, tidal marshes, and plants and animals and humans. We do still have seafood advisories from both this site and the Terry Creek site. And that is our high-level overview today that we're going to start with. I will go ahead and wrap up, and I appreciate you all joining us for our premier Tech Talks. Thank you so much.